2024 Bring Your Own Lunch Speakers Series at Lawrence Heritage State Park. My name is Rich Padover. I'm the summer interpretive tour guide here at Lawrence Heritage. And again, welcome to today's presentation. As always, feel free to help yourself to any refreshments that you'd like to my left there at the table. Today, well, before I introduce the speaker, we do have the August schedule put out now for the Bring Your Own Lunch speaker series. So if you're interested in seeing what's coming up for August, in the back of the room, it's the orange flyer on the table back there, as well as downstairs on the first floor. Okay, so the yellow flyer is for July for the speakers. The orange flyer is for August, for the speakers for August. All right. So today we are welcoming back our retired visitor services supervisor, Jim Beauchesne, who was here for over 23 years, right? 2050, but who's counting, right? You know. So some of you remember Jim when he was the VSS here. He retired just about 3 years ago, right? As of almost as of July 26th now, he'll be retired 3 years, right? I remember your birthday, yes, right? Yeah. Well, you know, in my job, I have to remember a lot of things, right? You are a wealth of facts. Yes, thank you, Jim. Yes. Jim will be talking to us today, discussing French-Canadian culture in Lawrence, St. Anne's Church School. At this point, I will turn it over to Jim.
Thank you, Rich, or should I say merci beaucoup? I'm not sure, do you folks need the amplification? If I just talk like this?
I can hear you fine.
You can hear me fine. Can everybody hear me fine? All right, because the thing kind of crackles a little. Okay, well, bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Je m'appelle Jim Beauchesne, and that is the last French you're going to hear from me. Okay? The talk I'm giving today is about the French-Canadian parochial schools and how they conducted themselves in the midst of changing social and political circumstances here in Lawrence, which was very similar to how it was done all across New England. Now, I did this talk once before at the History Center's symposium, the Lawrence History Center Symposium, back in April. And I wanted to do something about the parochial schools for the symposium because I don't think anybody else was doing a program about the parochial schools. And they're an important part of the history of education in Lawrence. Lawrence at one time had 11 Roman Catholic parishes, and to my knowledge, each and every one of them had a parochial school. So at one time, we were talking about probably 5,000 kids, maybe more, being educated in the parochial schools of Lawrence for most of the 20th century. So that's an important chapter in our history. And I happen to have a little bit of experience researching the French-Canadian community in Lawrence, and specifically St. Anne's Parish. So that's going to be my focus. Also because the parochial school experience in French-Canadian parishes like St. Anne's was somewhat unique, or I might say extreme, as compared to some of the other parochial schools. So let me get into it here. Let's see. The image on your screen, if I can get rid of that thing, yeah. The image on your screen is St. Anne's Church as it looks today. It's boarded up. The parish closed in 1991. But as you can see, it is a pretty massive church. Seats over 2,000 people. And they tell me it was filled 5 times on Sunday during the peak of the parish's existence. It's been closed now for about 31 years. But its closure was one of the things that inspired me to start doing research on St. Anne's and the French Canadians in Lawrence, because it seemed so permanent. It seemed, growing up here, it seemed like that was the Rock of Gibraltar and would be here forever. And the idea that it could close was a bit of a shock to me. So it kind of got me started on my historical research in that area. But I'm going to bring us further back in time to the arrival of the first Roman Catholic immigrant groups in Lawrence. You can probably guess who that was. Irish Catholics arriving at the time of the Irish potato famine in the late 1840s, and at the same time as Lawrence was being founded. So both Lawrence and a number of other cities in New England saw huge influx of Irish Catholic immigrants at that time. But they arrived in some pretty unwelcoming territory, or society, I should say. New England at that time in the 1840s and 50s was still almost exclusively English Protestant ancestry, or current at that time. And the Protestants who settled New England, or the Pilgrims and the Puritans, didn't care for the Catholic Church at all. One of the reasons they dissented from the Church of England was because they felt the Church of England didn't move away from Catholic practice and doctrine far enough. So they wanted to go more extreme than that. So the Irish were particularly welcome on arrival, and you may have heard about things like No Irish Need Apply, and the nativist movement, the anti-immigrant movement that emerged in the 1840s and 1850s. Very anti-Irish, Irish Catholic around here. Also anti-German, although German immigrants were more predominant in the Midwest, places like Cincinnati and Chicago eventually. So here there was very much antagonism toward the Irish. And one of the areas that this conflict played out was in the area of public education. Public schools, of course, reflected the society at the time, and of course back then there was prayer in public schools, but the prayers were Protestant prayers and readings from a Protestant version of the Bible, which Irish Catholic communities did not appreciate. You can also imagine that most of the teachers were not terribly warm and welcoming to the Irish Catholic kids. But one of the things they objected to was the portrayals of Roman Catholics in some of the textbooks they were using. So my next slide is a couple of pages from a geography book back in the 1840s. I don't know for a fact that this book was used in the Lawrence schools, but it's quite possible, and other books reflected the same kind of attitudes. So obviously you can't see the text here, but it says, in most Roman Catholic countries, the people are forbidden to read the Bible and many other books. And while there's often a large number of learned men, the people are generally very ignorant. Well, can you believe the Irish didn't like that kind of thing in their kids' textbooks? So there were repeated controversies and battles between Irish Catholic communities and the public schools in cities and towns all over the Northeast and beyond during this period of time. So next, we have another wave of Roman Catholic immigrants coming from Quebec, primarily. French Canadians coming down from Quebec, no longer able to survive on the farms of Quebec. You know, it's colder up there. And seeing opportunities in the textile cities of New England. So hundreds of thousands eventually over the course of about 60 years from the 1860s to the 1920s, about 500,000 French Canadians come down to New England. Mostly in the mill cities like Lawrence and Lowell and Manchester and Lewiston, Maine, and Woonsocket, Rhode Island, and many others, large and small. And you might think that the Irish Catholics would welcome them as another Catholic group coming to live here and, you know, adding to the numbers of Roman Catholics. But it wasn't so. The Irish actually had kind of a skeptical take on the arrival of the French Canadians because they were afraid that the arrival of this new wave of Catholic immigrants would set off a new wave of nativism and more protests and riots and disturbances that had happened when the Irish first arrived. So as it played out in Catholic churches, the Irish, who by then dominated the Catholic Church in this area, tried to get the French Canadians to accept English-speaking priests and to learn and speak English as quickly as possible to avoid nativist reaction. Of course, the Irish mostly spoke English, so that wasn't part of the anti-Irish nativism. But with the French Canadians, you add in the issue of language, of speaking a foreign language. So the Irish hierarchy wants the Catholics, French Canadian Catholics, to accept English-speaking priests. Well, the French Canadians won't have it. They want French-speaking priests. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is the fact that back in Canada, which of course had been taken over by England at the end of the French and Indian War, they're also known as the 7 Years' War between England and France. The British, you know, take Quebec and the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, etc. And in the settlement at the end of the war, England takes control of New France, the French colony in North America. Supposedly, the French had the option of keeping one Caribbean island, I think it was Martinique, versus Canada. And as vast as Canada is, Martinique was more valuable to France because it was a sugar-growing colony, and the sugar-growing colonies in the Caribbean were hugely profitable for the colonizing countries, England, France, and Spain too, maybe the Dutch. So France gave up Canada, and it became a British colony. So suddenly, after 150 years of settlement, the Roman Catholic French Canadians are ruled by English Protestants. And the French Canadians become second-class citizens in what had been their homeland. Now, the British don't oppress and suppress their Catholicism like they did to the Irish for some time. The British have kind of learned their lesson about oppressing people, which generates rebellions, and the Irish rebelled many times. So they're a little less heavy-handed in Canada, but it still leaves the French Canadians as being basically second-class citizens. One thing they learned is that the Protestants, the English Protestants, and a lot of Scotch that come to Canada as the upper class in many cases, they're English and they're Protestant. But everybody they know who is French is also Catholic. So they very much equate the two. To be French is to be Catholic, and to be Catholic is to speak French. So they come down here and find these Irish Catholic priests and others who speak English, and they actually have a little hard time believing that they're real Catholics, you know, because they don't speak French. There's one other thing underlying the French-Canadian attitude as they arrive in New England, and that is a cultural ethic called survivance, which simply means survivor. And under the English in Canada, the elites of French-Canadian society had decided that the people should remain, simple farmers on the land, the habitants of Quebec. And they envisioned a three-legged stool of the philosophy that should predominate. Survivance had three elements, one being retain the Catholic faith. That was the most important. Two being retain your Frenchness and the French language. And three, retain your traditional way of life, the life of the family farmer on the small farms of Quebec. Okay, and this was kind of in the air that people breathed. They wouldn't necessarily, the average person wouldn't know that this philosophy had a name, survivance and all that. It's just in the air that you breathe. These were the attitudes that prevailed. Now, coming down to New England from the farms of Quebec was, of course, a big violation of that third element, the traditional lifestyle of the Quebecois farmer. So that just puts more emphasis on the other two. Once you give up the traditional lifestyle, then keeping the faith and keeping the language becomes even more important to the folks who come down and create the little Canada's, the petit Canadas, in the mill towns of New England. So they're not crazy about the Irish Catholic hierarchy. In Lawrence, by 1869, I think, there's about 400 Catholic families. By 1871, there's enough of them to request and be given their own parish in Lawrence. So that's the beginning of St. Anne's Parish, established 1871. It was one of the first 10 French-Canadian parishes in New England. And it grows pretty quickly. Now, they are put, St. Anne's is eventually put under the control of the Marist priest, an order that was based in France, but in the late 19th century was experiencing some loss of privilege. France was secularizing in the late 19th century. The church was losing influence. They weren't exactly being oppressed, but they were losing privileges. So the Marists are looking for other places to go, and they discover that there's this burgeoning French-speaking Roman Catholic population in New England in the mill cities, folks coming down from Canada. So the Marists come to North America and are put in charge of St. Anne's Parish in, 1881. They immediately start building a church and a school. And I have some images of those. So that's the first church, and you may be familiar with this building. It is on Haverhill Street. They had to remove the steeple because it was in danger of collapsing. And then the building to the right was the rectory with priests lived. Now, that building burned about 30 years ago. But the church is still there. It has been converted to apartments recently in a very awkward and unappealing looking renovation, but it's in use at least. So that original church sat 1,100 people at a time, and the parish would outgrow it in 20 years. So I said they also built a school. So here's the first school. Now the building in front, which it looks like a typical house and may have predated the construction of the school, that I believe was the convent where the nuns lived. And then there's, there's this annex kind of building behind it, and then it's a much larger 3-story school building. So that accommodated 400 students, opened in 1884. Why so quick to build a school? Well, the problems with the public schools that the Irish have been fighting are still there, okay? They're still not treating Roman Catholics as, equal citizens, and they're still using Protestant Bible and prayers, etc. And as an example of that, this is, this is kind of an establishing shot. That's the view today from this position. Okay? So the convent and the school would be where the parking lot is now, and the big brick school building was built later, like 1910, I think. But that is what's there now. Okay. Pay no attention to the man destroying the exhibit there. In the gallery. So this is a textbook, a geography textbook from 1875, and see if they've made any progress here. Okay, it's a geography book. They're talking about Canada, and they're talking about the French Canadians, and it says they are a gay, polite, simple-hearted folk, generally quite ignorant. So we're still not crazy about public schools for French Canadian kids, and they built a big school almost immediately, serving 400 students. Let's see, so that they bring down nuns from Quebec to teach in the school, the Good Shepherd nuns, as they're popularly known. Their full name is a lot longer than that. The Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, which we all call the Good Shepherd nuns. So they come down from Quebec. So again, you've got French-speaking priests, French-speaking nuns, and soon after that, French-speaking brothers are brought in, Marist brothers, to teach the older boys in the school. And the schools, as I say, grow. They build a, build another school. No, that's not what I want. That's not what I want either. That's the second school building built, and now we're building in brick, really prominent, permanent structures. So that is just to the right of the older buildings, which you get a little look at there, the old convent. This building over here, I'm guessing, was the brothers' residence, which was separate from, separate, of course, from the nuns. When I was a kid, this was the girls' high school, but they kept building. And by the 1890s, there are 950 kids in St. Anne's parochial school. Now, it's not just the French Canadians who are doing this. Other Roman Catholic immigrant groups are doing this. And for some of the same reasons, their treatment in the public schools, but also because of an directive that comes down from the Roman Catholic hierarchy in America. In 1884, they have a plenary council, a big meeting, in Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore is significant because Maryland began as a colony that accepted Roman Catholics, right? Unlike the other early English colonies. So the Catholic Church is fairly prominent in Baltimore. So the bishops all meet in Baltimore in 1884, and they know about the problems Roman Catholics are having with the public schools all over. So they finally decide this. On the education of Catholic youth, Catholic schools, especially parochial schools, of their absolute necessity and the obligation of pastors to establish them. Parents must send their children to such schools unless the bishop should judge the reason for sending them elsewhere to be sufficient. Like if you just live too far from the nearest Catholic school, you're absolved. Ways and means are also considered for making the parochial schools more efficient. It is desirable that these schools be free, and every effort must be made to have suitable schools of higher education for Catholic youth. The bishops decide that we give up on the public schools. Roman Catholic kids should go to Catholic parochial schools, and every parish should create them. Well, St. Anne's is already well on its way in doing that. So, what is also happening at this time, however, in the 1890s now, is another tremendous wave of immigration coming from now southern and eastern Europe for the most part. The huge wave of immigrants that is famously processed through Ellis Island for the most part. So Southern Italians, Greeks, Poles, Lithuanians, Russian Jews, and many, many others are coming at this time. And this, of course, kicks off another wave of nativism, anti-immigrant animosity throughout the whole country. And it gets even more organized at this time. In the 1890s, there's a group formed by Harvard grads, who back then were all English Protestants, right? The Yankees of New England. And it's called the Immigration Restriction League. And some of its supporters include Henry Cabot Lodge, very prominent Yankee senator from Massachusetts, and his good buddy Teddy Roosevelt. So there's a movement to restrict immigration in different ways, growing at this time, at the time of all this immigration. Also at this time, well, a little later, we have World War I, which kicks off this huge wave of hyper-patriotism and skepticism about people who have a hyphenated identity. You know, you're supposed to be just an American, not a German-American, Franco-American, or whatever else. So that too adds to it. And then lastly is the fear of radicals, like the guys who led the Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence in 1912. So all these things are contributing to this atmosphere against immigrants. But again, part of it is about language. And in the French-Canadian schools, where the teachers are all French-speaking, and the ethic is to preserve French identity, schools are being taught entirely in French, all day, every day. They started that way in the 1880s, and they're still doing it that way in the 19-teens. Some people don't like it, but at the time, it was perfectly legal, and that's what they did. This will finally change in the 19-teens in this wave of anti-immigrant feeling, as a federal law passed requiring a literacy test. That's 1917. But a lot of the action is at the state level. And in the state of Massachusetts and others, laws passed requiring that the schools be taught, or that certain subjects be taught in English. So English, history, geography, mathematics, all these main subjects have to be taught in English. But the French-Canadian schools get around that by adopting a half and half day, half in English, half in French. So they'll teach those mandatory subjects in English, but then they'll teach music and religion and the French language and Canadian history in French for half the day. This goes on for about 35 years, until the 1950s. 1960s in New Hampshire, in Manchester, New Hampshire, I've been told. So that's how my parents were educated. That's how many thousands of people across New England in French-Canadian communities were educated with half and half school days. Where am I at? Oh, God, that's not where I want to be. All right, so we looked at the big school. Again, about early 20th century, there's 1,000 kids attending St. Anne's schools. They're using things like this, La Bonne Chanson, which is a book of French-Canadian songs, which I happen to have a copy of here, which you're welcome to look at afterwards. So this is published in Canada, and it is all songs, all in French, and all kind of celebrating that traditional lifestyle of the French family farm. And it includes a song like this one, which it's hard to read the title there with the artwork, but it's Canadien toujours, always Canadian. So that's what's being taught in the schools at St. Anne's and many others. So this is from the 1940s. This is the parish bulletin. So they put out a monthly bulletin. It's like a little magazine. Oh, I got it right here. About 40 pages with some ads by local, French businessmen, Langevin's funeral home, and so on. And there's only one article in here in English. It's almost entirely in French. This is 1943. So the parish is still operating in a very, very French milieu. Let's see. Where am I at? So I said that the schools taught half and half days until the 1950s at St. Anne's and others. And the early 1950s is another watershed moment in this history and also in our country, because right after World War II, we have the second Red Scare and McCarthyism, and again, this tremendous pressure to Americanize, to talk English, not to kind of put your immigrant past behind you. And the folks at St. Anne's decided it's time to go all English. So in the early 1950s, the schools just began to teach the day entirely in English, and more of the parish's business is being conducted in English, more masses in English, etc., etc. So that's how it was when I went to school at St. Anne's, starting in 1962. Everything was done in English except for classes in French. And despite years of classes in French, I never learned to actually speak it. Mine is the generation where our parents spoke French over the dinner table when they didn't want the kids to understand what they were saying. Which is a common experience. And also, me and my kid, there are so many assimilating influences going on in the 1950s. Popular culture in terms of movies, so they've been around a while, but then TV are all kind of homogenizing people. And in my example, for instance, I grew up on the Flintstones and Gilligan's Island. So, no French spoken on those shows. But oddly, while I was attending St. Anne's in the 60s, there was this last little wave of immigrants from Quebec. And ironically, they came to Lawrence for some of the same reasons as some of the early Hispanic immigrants, namely for jobs in the shoe shops that had moved into the vacated textile mills. The shoe shops and some garment shops moved into the vacated textile mills. It was cheap space, and they thought they could get some cheap labor as well. But of course, by then a lot of people had moved out of Lawrence after the mills closed, either for that reason or just to move to the suburbs, which was the thing to do in the 50s and 60s. So they had to hunt for workers in these garment shops, and that drew some of the Hispanic immigrants, but also this late wave from Quebec. And I went to school with some of the kids of these families. And of course, fresh from Quebec, they spoke French and little or no English. And to me and my classmates, these kids were foreigners. So, assimilation had been finally achieved in mine, but mine was the fourth generation. So it took kind of a generation longer than for many other groups. Part of that was because of obviously the French instruction in the French Canadian parochial schools. There are a couple of other things that delayed assimilation, I should say. Concentration in the textile industry, which by the 1920s was already in decline, meant that economic mobility was somewhat delayed for French Canadian population. And of course, economic mobility goes along with getting more education and being more assimilated and speaking English and all that. Also the geography, simple fact of the geography of Quebec being right across the border allowed for constant replenishment of the culture as people went back and forth to visit relatives, and some went up to Quebec to further their education. The really bright kids were strongly encouraged to consider becoming priests or nuns, and if they were thinking about that, then they might go to high school at a seminary in Quebec. So there's this constant replenishment of the culture. Nevertheless, 1960s begins to see the decline of the parish. The girls' high school closed in 1970. And of course, people are moving out to the suburbs, Salem, New Hampshire, and so on. And the church, the parish, I should say, or the school, does begin to educate many Hispanic kids who are now moving into the neighborhood. But by 1991, they can't keep it going anymore. There aren't enough priests, there aren't enough nuns, and they've got these huge buildings huge cost buildings that are costly to maintain, the church, etc. So the parish closes, and with it, the school. And like I say, at that time, it was a shock to me, even though I hadn't lived in Lawrence for quite a while. And this is well before the parish closings that occurred after the sex abuse scandal. That's after 2000. So this was kind of not unique, but a rare situation. So what else do I have to say? Not much. School today. Oh yeah. So after the parish closed, the remaining school building, which is this building here, was first used as a public school by the Lawrence Public Schools. They call it the Haverhill Street School. And then more recently, it's been taken over by the Lawrence Family Development Charter School, which began on West Street, and then in its growth needed more space, so they took over the school building where I went to school way back when, and it is now serving as a school today for the immigrant kids in Lawrence, which is good. And that's it for my talk. And I'd love to have some questions or comments or contributions of people who have their own experiences going to parochial schools. Yes, Louise?
I have no experience with Catholic schools. But was it Sacred Heart was the first name?
Yes.
You didn't mention it.
Well, I didn't mention any of the others.
Okay.
There were, as I did say, there were 11, I think, Roman Catholic parishes in Lawrence, each with a parochial school. Sacred Heart, which you mentioned, was indeed a French-Canadian parish. It was an offshoot of St. Anne's.
Okay.
It started as a mission from St. Anne's, and then was designated its own parish. Early 20th century, I forget. Same is true of Mount Carmel in Methuen.
Where?
Mount Carmel, which is in West Methuen, was also a mission church coming out of St. Anne's.
We got, a few years before I left the library, a nun contacted me and asked me if I wanted Sacred Heart yearbooks. And we got this big file of them that are going off to be scanned. Let me say also. What became of that building is sort of interesting to me too, because
Well, the church is now owned by a kind of Catholic splinter group that conducts Latin masses.
Yes, I know that too. Yes.
I don't know what happened to the school building.
Housing.
It's about.
Is housing?
It's
A
housing.
lot of them get converted to housing.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
One more comment.
Yes, please.
You're talking about parents speaking French, and not so that you guys can. When I lived in Israel, and a lot of information about all their immigrants coming, they always talked about that language as bedroom language. Mom and dad's language, and then from whatever it might be, they didn't want their kids to understand. I just thought the idea.
Yeah, that was not unusual.
No.
Immigrant families from wherever.
I'd be willing to bet my parents would love cats.
Anybody else?
I mentioned the girls' school.
Yeah.
Was there also boys' school?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. I don't know if you heard, the question was there also a boys' school? I mean, the original grammar school was for boys and girls, of course. But then they built a girls' high school. There was also, for a time, a boys' high school. Started in, I think, the 1920s. And let's see, the Maris brothers were giving the instruction at the boys' high school. I don't think it had its own building. I think it was like a couple of classes in one of the regular buildings, a couple of classrooms. But that didn't last long. The Maris brothers decided to instead create a pan-ethnic boys' high school in Lawrence. That was the birth of Lawrence Central Catholic High School. Okay? And there's kind of a story behind that, if you will indulge me. I think that the Maris brothers were inspired to create an all-ethnic, boys' high school, partly as a result of something that was happening in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, which was a very French town, over 50%. And in Woonsocket, the French Canadian had already created their own all-boys high school. So that the parish had a very, prominent, well-established boys high school. And then the archdiocese, still run by Irish priests, wanted to create a pan-ethnic boys high school for Woonsocket. And they're going to charge people with their monthly collection, an additional collection to fund this pan-ethnic boys high school. The leaders of the French Canadian community object because they already gave their donations to create the boys high school. They don't want to be taxed effectively to create a pan-ethnic high school. So it's tremendous controversy that roils the community in Woonsocket for a couple of years. The leaders of the community are against it, but the French priests, being obedient, go along with the archdiocese. It kind of splits the community, undermines the authority of the church for a lot of people. The guy that this was called the Sentinel Affair because the guy who led the objection was the owner, editor of the local French paper called the Sentinel. At some point, he is excommunicated by the Pope. I mean, this thing went up to Rome, the appeal to resolve this thing. So I think the creation of Central Catholic may have been partly in reaction to that, to try to avoid that kind of really contentious dispute within the community. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Yes.
How did the curriculum look like in terms of composition subjects? Was that pretty similar to what the public schools are?
Well, I don't know. I think by the time I was going to school, it was very similar. All the basic subjects, math, history, English, geography, etc. But we were taught French, which I don't think was standard in public school, but everybody took it. And of course, religion was a class every day, which you wouldn't see in the public schools. At one time, in the French Canadian parochial schools, they were teaching something called Histoire Sainte, which was the history of early Canada and the Jesuit missionaries who, famously tried to convert the Native Americans, and a number of whom died horrible deaths as martyrs to the faith. So I don't think they were getting that in public schools. But that was gone by the time I went to school.
That would have been an interesting class. We know about that.
Anybody?
I know there's a
Yes, please.
difference in the interpretation of the Bible between the Catholics and Protestants. But is there much of a physical difference in the Bible?
Yeah, I don't know the specifics. I know the King James Bible is what the Protestants were using, and the Catholics were using something else. And of course, as the one of the geography books says, Roman Catholics were discouraged from reading the Bible, and there's actually some truth to that. Education was not deemed as important in Quebec as it was in New England, because for the Puritans, everybody was supposed to be able to read the Bible for themselves, and so they had to be literate. So New England had this incredibly high literacy rate, whereas in Quebec and some other Catholic countries, the priest read it for you, and they told you what it said. So you didn't have to.
A lot of that was in Latin services.
Yeah, the masses, of course, before the early 60s were almost entirely in Latin. Only the sermon would be in English or French or whatever.
You mentioned during the 1912 strike, St. Anne's was involved in some fashion, the priests did going around.
During the strike of 1912, popularly known as the Red and Roses strike, the Catholic Church eventually came out against the strike because of the leading role played by the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, who are a very radical union. Their philosophy was basically a version of socialism, and that was beyond the pale to the Catholic Church because that's going to lead you down the primrose path to atheism, which is the worst thing there is. So they came out against the strike. Now, initially, it was a little mixed reaction by the church. The pastor of Holy Rosary, the Italian church, was actually running a soup kitchen for strikers, so he was a little sympathetic to it. But the pastor at St. Anne's was very much opposed to the strike, and in the early weeks, he became the poster boy for Catholic opposition to the strike, only because Father O'Reilly of St. Mary's was out of town on vacation when the strike was. So Father Plasmans, who was the pastor of St. Anne's, who was a Marist, who was born and trained in France, and may have had some conflicts with organized labor and radicals in France, but I don't know. There's a cryptic reference that something happened in France. But anyway, he comes out strongly against the strike. The strike leaders go to see him one time, and they don't agree, and that's that. But also, they actually had the priests of the parish, and they had 6 at that time. That's how big the parish was. They had the priests go house to house to the parishioners, telling them, don't get involved in the strike. It's bad, the people who are running it are bad, and you want to be a good citizen. At one point, one of the French priests is quoted as saying, all authority comes from God. So the mill owners, God put them there, so you should do what they tell them. So that was the attitude, and there wasn't much participation in the strike by French Canadians. My grandfather's experience was more typical. He didn't cross the picket lines, But he didn't join the picket lines. He found work in Amesbury until all the trouble blew over. A lot of people did that. So the strikers met by ethnic group, Italians, Lebanese, Poles, Lithuanians, etc. But the French meetings were mainly led by the Franco-Belgians. There wasn't a separate one for French Canadians. If any of them wanted to go to a meeting, they would go to the Franco-Belgians because they were radicals.
They had a French-American club on Mason Street in Lawrence that
That was the Franco-Belgian Hall. It was a big hall for strike activities, soup kitchens, meetings, etc. That was one of the main headquarters of meeting places.
Were there Franco-Belgians who were met or were they all secular?
I think there were, I don't know that for a fact. There was no Franco-Belgian parish. So presumably those that were, remained faithful Catholics were to St. Anne's. Interesting question. Yes?
The history of the convent of St. Pat's.
The convent at St. Pat's?
Yes.
I don't know.
There's a reason why I'm asking.
Yes, please tell us.
Now, I cannot remember how many years ago, but it's now, it was a Catholic amenity house where it's now 10 condos, 8 and 2 bedroom and 2 3 bedroom. How I noticed it's like way down here inside. So, all condos. What it is now, I'm not too sure, there's all kinds of building outside, construction going on.
Well, they got a big donation from Peter Lynch, I think.
I thought about this because Lawrence history has been something that interests me. But you have 3 eras of religion in the city. It starts out a Protestant city, so many Protestant churches. What I remember, Irish Catholics at the beginning had to walk to Lowell to go to church. Okay? Then it became really Catholic from 1890 till I got here, basically. And now it's much more ecumenical. It's still somewhat Catholic and a little bit Protestant, but you see all these signs up for small churches in a number of locations. I just find that sort of thing interesting. And I'm going to add one other thing. I'm originally from Oklahoma, and they had just had a law passed where every school, every classroom in the state has to teach the Bible.
Oh, God.
And I contacted my sister's ex-husband, and he, real adult, I still know out there. He doesn't approve of it, but that's the direction. Well, yeah,
I'm afraid
little
so.
world is very
What
interesting.
was, in Florida passed something similar?
No, it was Louisiana that passed the Ten Commandments. And I would wonder, once the kids can read, what they think about do not look after your neighbor's wife. I've always thought that was a little bit curious, but
Indeed.
I don't make the rules.
So I wonder what Bible they're going to use.
That's
Yeah.
The photo that you showed at the beginning, the current photo, saying it's in 1991, when the Maris fathers decided to leave, it is true that the numbers had really diminished, and thus the collections had diminished, the finances had diminished. But every church building, including St. Anne's, is actually owned by the Archbishop of Boston, the Archdiocese of Boston. So the Maris fathers told the Archdiocese they didn't have the people, so they didn't have the finances, and they needed the finances because St. Anne's, the building, was becoming structurally unsound. And it was going to take a great deal of money to make it sound. And the Archdiocese said, we're not going to put that money into it. And so that actually was one of the deciding factors for the Maris fathers to leave. They still had, obviously, Mount Carmel, Teresa's and Sacred Heart, but those buildings were sound. So it wasn't the same issue there. So they made that decision, and that's why, even though today a lot of former churches, as you have said, become condos and other purposes, St. Anne's never was. It remains boarded today because it is structurally unsound, and now 30-something years later, probably even more structurally unsound. And you can make the case, well, why not simply demolish it, which someday it may be, but that's an expensive proposition. And until they can find somebody that's willing to pay for the property and the demolition, it's just going to stand.
Well, there is news on that front. There is a group that bought the church within the last 6 months or so, maybe a year. And it is a Protestant congregation that is based in Brazil. So presumably they're planning to convert it into a church for their faith. I don't know that there are that many Brazilians nearby. We do have a big Brazilian community in Framingham or native. Lola's?
And there's no place to build in that city. So,
And there was a movement at a time to convert the church into some kind of a performance, cultural arts center, etc., which was talked about for years. But, there just never was enough oomph behind it, meaning money, to make it happen. And there are a number of obstacles, such as the fact that the lack of parking was deemed very challenging for us to be reused as a performance center. All right, well, thank you, folks.